we have a great deal of regard for, as you all know. Um, we call him a friend. As a matter of fact, I probably, well, it's a fact, I wouldn't be on MSNBC as frequently as I am if it weren't for him. And so we are always thankful for that. His new book is out. I have read it in its entirety. It is amazing. Let me first of all congratulate him, Lawrence O'Donnell, the author of the new book, Playing with Fire, the 1968 Election and the Transformation of Electoral Politics by Lawrence O'Donnell, the host of The Last Word on MSNBC. Lawrence, how are you this morning, man?
Great to be here, Mark.
It is. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Lawrence, I want to get right into the book. Um, you have drawn a comparison between George Wallace and Donald Trump in terms of 1968, in terms of the stuff that George Wallace was doing. But in reading your book, I'm going to try to be a good student. I would also maybe even draw a comparison between RFK in 1968 and Bernie Sanders in 2016. And by her own admission, Hillary Clinton's aspirations were to be like LBJ. I think that kind of comes through in your book in terms of 1968. Am I off base?
Yeah, that's correct. The dynamics of the parties that we live with today were established in 1968. When I first started thinking about Trump last year, my mind went back to Sarah Palin and thinking like, oh, okay, well that explains it. The party became the party in defense of ignorance when Sarah Palin was running on the Republican vice presidential ticket, and this is just an outgrowth of that. But it goes back much farther than that. And last year, I actually interviewed on the show George Wallace's campaign manager, who, by the way, changed his life completely after working for Wallace's 68 presidential campaign. He ended up becoming a civil rights lawyer and doing very honorable work in most of the rest of the decades of his life. And so that campaign manager for Wallace told me that when he listens to Trump, he was hearing George Wallace. And it was the way they both were very, very vague about policy, but just promising basically that the people that you don't like will suffer under them. That was their basic message. Vote for me, and the people you don't like are going to have a very bad day every day. And also, Wallace was the very first candidate to use the protesters in his rally audiences as a way of showing off how tough he is. And so Wallace welcomed those protesters. No one else welcomed protesters. And then the next candidate who welcomed protesters every time was
Right.
Trump. And that was straight out of the Wallace playbook, to Trump standing up there saying, I want to punch him in the face, all that stuff. That was pure George Wallace. And on the Democratic side, we saw for the very first time an insurgency from the left side of the Democratic Party against the establishment. In this case, the first move was made by Senator Eugene McCarthy, Democrat, running against Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, a sitting president. We'd never seen this before. Challenging the sitting president of your own party in the New Hampshire primary. And Gene McCarthy finished very strong in the New Hampshire primary against Johnson, shocked everyone. And then Bobby Kennedy, a few days later, jumped into the race. So there were two candidates coming from the left of the Democratic establishment. And as usual, the party establishment did not see that coming, and that's still true. The party establishment did not see Bernie Sanders coming a year ago. Whenever something new and important and different is happening within a party, the establishment is the last to know. And that was true on the Republican side. The establishment did not see Trump coming. They were completely shocked and taken by surprise that there were all these voters out there that they had been pandering to for years in different ways, who were now vulnerable to the appeal of Trump, and a lot of why they were vulnerable was a lot of what the Republican Party had been selling them for many years.
You're right. I just want to list, because the way you write this, it really crystallizes it. Wallace masterfully toyed with the anger of his audiences. He drove them to fits of outrage, always trying to bring them back to the brink of violence before holding them back. He made sure there was more than enough tension at his events that it always felt like anything might happen at any moment, and that always made news. I mean, you could substitute the name Trump for Wallace right there, Lawrence.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also had dynamics unleashed in 1968 that we live with today. At the beginning of 1968, two of the front runners for the Republican nomination were liberals, George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller. There were liberal Republicans. There were conservative Democrats.
Right.
Now there are no liberal Republicans. There are no conservative Democrats. And that was locked in cement basically in 1968. The very last liberal standing on a Republican convention stage was in 1968 when the mayor of New York, Republican John Lindsay, had to get up on that stage and second the nomination of Spiro Agnew as the Republican vice presidential candidate. And not long after that, a couple of years after that, John Lindsay wasn't a Republican anymore. He understood there was absolutely no space left in this party for anything but the conservatives. Another phrase I came into our politics in 1968 that everyone's going to recognize, and that's the phrase law and order, which is what Richard Nixon used as the Republican candidate. Every Republican candidate since then, including Trump, says, "I'm the law and order candidate." And that came from George Wallace. George Wallace in 1967, before the campaign started, said, "I don't talk about segregation anymore. I talk about law and order." And Nixon heard that, and Nixon said, that's what, I can use that. I can use that same phrase to appeal to that white Southern voter who likes the sound of George Wallace.
It most definitely. And so it eventually Nixon would adopt law and order as much as Wallace, as you write, and take his cue. So in that way, Trump is a lot like Wallace, but he's a lot like Nixon too, isn't he?
Absolutely, because Nixon was desperately needed to get the Wallace vote. We had Wallace was running as a third-party candidate, and he started to surge in September, and he started to pull votes in a very serious way. He was pulling votes away from Nixon. And so meanwhile, the Republicans were trying to develop has become their Southern strategy. They needed the voter that the segregationist Wallace already had. And so Nixon had to do everything he could to sound exactly like George Wallace without going over that line to the point where he could lose some northern voters who he was trying to appeal to at the same time. And that's just a rhetorical line to not go there. And so Wallace is the great sort of uncredited inspiration for Republican politics from 1968 forward.
Most definitely. There was also, Lawrence O'Donnell with us, folks, there was also a lot of turmoil on the Democratic side because there was a lot of back and forth. As your book chronicles, we all know LBJ decided not to run, but he was going to run at first. Then there was going to be a last-minute effort at the convention for him to get thrown in the nomination. We know Bobby Kennedy vacillated. McCarthy himself vacillated. I mean, they're the only candidate, it seems, in 1968 that was hellfire sure all the way through that he was going to get in the race and stay in it was Richard Nixon.
Yeah, that's right. Nixon was and Nixon, had been pretty much he sort of publicly quit politics in 1962. He lost the presidential election in 1960. Richard Nixon was the first vice president, sitting vice president, to lose a presidential election, first one in history. In 1960, he lost by less than 1% of the vote to John Kennedy. And then in 1962, he ran for governor of California and lost that race. And in a very bitter final press conference after that California loss, he said, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." He said that to the press. And that was taken as the most dramatic and bitter public resignation from politics in history. And then shortly after that, he started plotting his way back. So he was the one, he knew in 1964 that he was going to run in 1968. And his mission in 1964 was to look as if he was being as helpful as possible to Republican Barry Goldwater, who Nixon was sure was going to lose, so Nixon could then position himself as the loyal Republican for 68. But Mark, there's so many dramatic stories and events that happened in this election year that in any other election year, that single event would be the biggest event of the year. LBJ, the President of the United States, simply dropping out and deciding in the middle of the campaign not to run for re-election. Gigantic event. Has never happened since. It would be the biggest thing that could possibly happen in a year. Robert Kennedy assassinated on the night that he wins the California primary and now seems poised to go on to Chicago to get the nomination. He's assassinated on the floor of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. 2 months before that, Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated, the most important civil rights leader in history, a hugely important political figure in the United States at the time, even though he himself never ran for office. On the Democratic side of our politics, all politicians were desperately concerned with what Dr. King thought, and would he say something favorable about them? Would he endorse them? That he was crucially important to our politics. And it was a very daunting writing exercise, Mark. When I started doing this, I realized about a third of the way into the work, I am going to have to write some scenes that I witnessed as a kid when I was in high school, meaning I witnessed them on TV and the news coverage of them. Scenes that are some of the most important scenes in the history of the United States, and in Martin Luther King's case, in the world. I'm going to have to write the scene of the assassination of Martin Luther King. I'm going to have to write the scene of the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And it was a very difficult arena to approach as a writer, because so many great writers have come before me in this space, and to try to find your own personal view of what happened on those days, what was my approach to it, because I was a high school kid, and a certain amount of what you're reading is researched history, and a certain amount of what you're reading is an eyewitness sensation of being alive in America at that time and feeling the way these events moved through our society and feeling the way they shocked the body of the United States.
Well, and also Lawrence O'Donnell with us, folks. You talked about how it touched you. You lost a beloved cousin in Vietnam. I think at least one of your brothers went on to enlist, and you came within a week of reporting after being drafted, I believe. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what I was talking about in all of that is that there was a very personal threat in America in 1968, and the personal threat was to everyone, and that is that someone you know, someone you love could be killed in Vietnam, and either next week or next year. And every man 18 years old and older had a draft card in their pocket, and if you weren't carrying your draft card in your pocket, it was a federal crime to not have it with you. And destroying your draft card was made a federal crime in 1965 because kids started burning their draft cards in 1964. And it was inconceivable that anyone would destroy a draft card, so they hadn't realized they had to make it a crime. And that draft card could get you shipped out to Vietnam. The draft was the fastest way to get there, and everyone lived in fear of that. and people schemed in different ways, thinking, well, if I enlist, maybe I'll get a better assignment. That's what happened to my brother, and he ended up staying in the United States for the whole time. My cousin was a West Point graduate. He graduated and was killed in Vietnam within 90 days of his graduation. And that was my first military funeral, was 1968. But there were 16,000 of those funerals in the United States in 1968.
Yeah.
Over 16,000 families were standing at those funerals that year. And so the threat was personal, it was real, it was immediate. And my draft notice came in 1972. I tell this at the end of the book, and I was in college at the time, and I passed the physical, and you go home and you wait for the letter saying where you should report. And within a few days of passing the physical, President Nixon ended the draft. And so none of us who had our physicals that day ended up serving in the Army. But that draft ended on that day because Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and Gene McCarthy started their anti-war political movement in 1968. And Martin Luther King turning his voice into an anti-war voice was the most important turn of that period. And those voices ended the war sooner than it was going to end, and they ended the draft sooner than it was going to.
Yeah. Dr. King also, just in terms of all the different scenes, Dr. King, the peace movement tried to draft him to run for president. President, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who didn't know, he turned it down. LBJ had already declined to run because of the war. But then when he was thinking about showing up at the convention and surprising everyone, the rebellion in Chicago didn't help either. And that pretty much killed and dashed those hopes. And then finally, the culminating scene, Nixon himself, we now know more than ever about his role in interfering with the Paris peace talks. And LBJ was aware of that too, wasn't he, Lawrence?
Yeah, this was the original case of collusion. This is Richard Nixon as a candidate colluding with South Vietnam, telling them through their embassy in Washington and through a secret connection he had to them that they should not agree to any discussions that LBJ wants them to have. And they had already agreed. South Vietnam's president had already said to President Johnson, yes, we will be in Paris in 2 days. And Nixon managed to stop them from going because Nixon needed the war to be going badly on Election Day. He always believed that. So Nixon was willing and actively took measures to continue to have American soldiers killed in Vietnam so that he could be elected president. And President Johnson found out about this through the CIA less than a week before the election. He was threatening to make it public, but his senior advisors told him it's too dangerous to make it public because that will reveal our intelligence sources and it will look very political if you do that. People will think you're trying to influence the election. President Johnson was torn. It's one of the most dramatic parts of the book, and he eventually decided not to make it public. And Richard Nixon went on to win.
Also, just one other player in the drama was Teddy Kennedy. There was a last-minute effort to try to draft him at the '68 convention. He chose not to. Did Ted Kennedy miss his moment then, do you think, Lawrence?
That's the biggest mystery to me in the whole thing, and that was the biggest discovery. I did not know that Ted Kennedy was a possibility during the Democratic Convention. As I say, I was a kid in high school watching the convention in our living room. But in the research, what I discovered was that there was a last-minute move to try to draft Ted Kennedy as the Democratic nominee, and he was very, very reluctant about it and basically said, only if this can work absolutely flawlessly will I do it. And then there was a moment where the effort of what they were trying to do leaked and became public. There was a news report about it, and as soon as there was a news report about what they were trying to do, Teddy Kennedy pulled out, said, absolutely not, I'm not going to do it. And so we came very, very close, though, to him being drafted as the nominee, and that would have been a complete rewrite of history. Would he have beaten Richard Nixon? We don't know.
Indeed. The book Playing with Fire. Lawrence, we appreciate you. Listen, man, I see a miniseries. What do you think?
Yes, that's what it feels like. That's what I felt like I was writing, Mark, because I've written a lot of things for the screen in the past, and it felt as I was writing it that I was looking at it through the camera.
Indeed, indeed. Outstanding book. I strongly recommend it. Some really riveting history and told in a very dramatic way. It's dramatic on its own, but Lawrence really does set the scenes almost like a screenplay. Playing with Fire, the 1968 election and the transformation of American politics. And the very last thing I'll say, Lawrence, is we thought 2016 was high drama. But when you read this book, you're reminded 2016 was almost nothing, folks, compared to 1968 with the assassinations. As Lawrence writes, they had become almost commonplace in America, kind of like gun violence and mass shootings have become today. But when you read this book, you realize 2016 was almost a walk in the park compared to 1968, wasn't it, Lawrence?
Yeah, it really was. 2016 was a totally normal presidential campaign, except for one very weird character.
Indeed, indeed. Lawrence O'Donnell. Lawrence, congratulations on the book. I know you're out on the book tour. Good luck with all of that. And this is really, really a treasure you've written. Thank you, man. Okay?
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Okay, take care now. All right, bye-bye. And folks, let's just mention, too, also in 1968, Dick Gregory ran as a write-in candidate, as a matter of fact. All right, we'll take another break. We'll be right back. Sirius XM Progress 127. Resistance Radio. Get woke, get ready for impeachment. This is MIP.
Get ready for impeachment.